The mansion sat in complete darkness except for one room. Harold Easton, worth $2.3 billion, sat alone at a dining table built for 24. 78 years old. Christmas Eve. And not a single person had called. Not one. The food his staff had prepared before leaving, prime rib, roasted vegetables, truffle mashed potatoes, sat untouched, growing cold. He stared at his phone. 0 notifications. The silence pressed against his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. This was the man who once controlled boardrooms, commanded empires, decided the fate of thousands with a signature. Now, he couldn't even get his own son to answer a text message. But then the doorbell rang. At 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, someone was at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one knew he was here. When he opened that door, he had no idea his entire life was about to change. Because standing in the snow, shivering and desperate, was a young father and his 7-year-old daughter who were about to teach him what wealth really means. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Tokyo, midnight in London, afternoon in Brazil, or evening in Australia, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The house stretched out around Harold like a museum after closing time. 15,000 square feet of marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and rooms he hadn't entered in months. Maybe years. The Christmas tree in the grand foyer stood 20 feet tall, professionally decorated with gold and silver ornaments that caught the light from the chandelier above. Every branch perfectly spaced. Every ribbon precisely tied. Not a single handmade ornament. Not one crooked angel or lopsided star crafted by small hands. His decorator had outdone herself this year, he supposed. The garland wrapped the banister leading up the curved staircase with mathematical precision. Wreaths hung on doors that never opened. The whole display looked like something out of a magazine spread. Beautiful. Lifeless. Empty. He'd sent his staff home at 6 that evening, insisting they spend Christmas Eve with their families. His housekeeper Maria had hesitated at the door, her kind eyes searching his face with concern he pretended not to see. She'd asked if he was sure if he'd be all right alone. He'd waved her off with practiced dismissal, told her to enjoy her grandchildren, slipped her an extra $1,000 bonus. The truth was he couldn't bear the thought of them staying. Couldn't stand the idea of them witnessing what Christmas Eve had become for him. Watching him eat alone, seeing the phone that never rang. Their pity would have been worse than the solitude. So he'd smiled and closed the door and listened to their cars pull away down the long driveway, their taillights disappearing through the iron gates. And then the silence had settled in like fog. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked, each second echoing through rooms designed for gatherings, for laughter, for life. Instead, they held only the sound of time passing. Harold sat at the head of the dining table, a custom-made piece of black walnut that had cost $40,000. 24 chairs surrounded it. He'd hosted exactly 3 dinners here in the 5 years since he'd had it made. Business associates, strategic partnerships, deals that needed the veneer of hospitality. Tonight, all 23 empty chairs stared at him like an accusation. His phone sat face up on the table beside his crystal water glass. The screen was dark, had been dark all day. Harold picked it up for the 100th time, thumbed it awake, checked for messages he knew weren't there. His son Dylan's contact information glowed on the screen when he scrolled to the D's. Dylan Easton. No photo. Harold couldn't remember the last time he'd seen his son smile at him, let alone posed for a picture together. 3 years. 3 years since they'd spoken. The fight had been about inheritance, about Dylan wanting his share early, about accusations of control and manipulation that had cut deeper than Harold wanted to admit. Dylan had called him a tyrant, had said he'd rather be poor than wait for blood money. Harold had responded by threatening to write him out of the will entirely. Prideful. Stupid. And now neither of them knew how to bridge the gap they'd created. Harold's thumb hovered over Dylan's name. He could call. Could try. Could say Merry Christmas at least. But what if Dylan didn't answer? What if he did answer and his voice was cold, distant, filled with that particular brand of disappointment that sons reserve for fathers who failed them? Harold locked the phone, set it down, picked it back up, scrolled to his daughter's contact. Vanessa Easton. Also no photo. Also no communication in years. She blocked his number after her wedding 2 years ago. He'd made the mistake of investigating her fiancé, hiring a private detective to dig into the man's finances. When he'd confronted Vanessa with his findings, the student loans, the mediocre credit score, the string of failed business ventures, she looked at him with something worse than anger. Disgust. She told him he'd turned everything, even love, into a transaction. That he measured people's worth in dollars and couldn't recognize value that didn't appear on a balance sheet. She'd gotten married without him there. He'd heard about it through his lawyer. Now she was Vanessa Pierce, and he didn't even know her address. His contact list was long. Hundreds of names. Business partners, lawyers, accountants, board members, executives from companies he'd acquired over 40 years of building his empire. He scrolled through them slowly, recognizing how few of these people he'd spoken to since retirement 5 years ago. The calls had stopped almost immediately. Lunch invitations dried up. The colleagues who'd once competed for his attention vanished the moment he stopped being useful to their careers. Not one had reached out today. Not one Christmas text. He'd made himself indispensable to their ambitions and completely disposable to their affections. The memories came without permission, sliding into his mind like unwelcome guests. Dylan at 9 years old, standing in his Little League uniform in the doorway of Harold's home office. "The championship game starts in an hour, Dad. Can you come?" Harold barely looking up from the contract he'd been reviewing. "Not today, champ. This deal closes tomorrow. I'll catch the next one." But there hadn't been a next one. The season ended. Dylan stopped asking. Then there was Vanessa at 16, dressed for her first school dance, descending the stairs while Harold talked on his phone to Tokyo. She'd waited at the bottom step for him to notice, to say something about how beautiful she looked. He'd waved at her absently, covered the phone's mouthpiece long enough to say have fun, then returned to his call about quarterly projections. Her face had fallen. She'd left with her friends, and he'd forgotten she'd even been there by the time he'd hung up. The recital she'd invited him to. The graduation he'd missed because of a last-minute board meeting. The father-daughter dance she'd stopped asking him to attend after the 3rd year of excuses. And Patricia. God, Patricia. His wife had gotten sick 10 years ago. Breast cancer. Stage 3. She'd sat him down in this very dining room and told him the diagnosis, her hands shaking as she explained the treatment plan, the surgery, the chemotherapy that would start in 2 weeks. Harold had listened, had asked practical questions about the oncologist's credentials, the hospital's reputation, the cost of experimental treatments, had immediately pulled out his phone to call the best cancer specialists in the country, had arranged consultations at Mayo Clinic, at Johns Hopkins, at Sloan Kettering, had thrown money at the problem like money could solve it. Patricia had asked him to come to her first chemotherapy appointment. He'd been in London closing an acquisition. She'd asked him to sit with her during the hard days when the treatment made her so sick she couldn't get out of bed. He'd hired the best private nurses money could buy. She'd asked him to just be there, to hold her hand, to watch movies with her and pretend for a few hours that their life wasn't falling apart. He'd sent his assistant Margaret Vale instead, a kind woman who'd sat with Patricia when he couldn't, who'd become more family to his dying wife than he'd managed to be. And then one night, 3 months before she died, Patricia had looked at him from her hospital bed with eyes that had already started saying goodbye. The machines beeped steadily around her. The 4 drip counted down the minutes. And she'd said it, the thing he couldn't forget, the thing that haunted him every single day since. "You're going to end up alone, Harold. And you'll deserve it." He'd been angry at the time, had told himself she was being dramatic, cruel even. How could she say that when he'd spent hundreds of thousands on her treatment, when he'd gotten her the best care available, when he'd done everything he could, except the one thing she'd actually wanted? Him. Just him. Present. Attentive. There. He'd been reviewing paperwork for an acquisition when she'd said it. He remembered that detail with perfect clarity. The papers had been spread across the rolling table next to her bed. He'd been more focused on those papers than on his dying wife. And 3 months later she was gone. And now, 10 years after that, she'd been right. Harold stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. He couldn't sit anymore. Couldn't look at that phone that wouldn't ring. He walked through the house, his footsteps echoing off walls hung with expensive art he bought at auction because advisors told him it would appreciate in value. He passed the sitting room with furniture no one had ever sat in, the library with leather-bound books he'd never read, the music room with a piano no one played. His reflection caught him off guard in the hallway mirror. He stopped, stared. The man looking back was old. When had that happened? He knew he was 78. The number was just a number. But the face in the mirror told a different story. Deep lines carved around his mouth, around his eyes. Not laugh lines. Worry lines. Stress lines. Lines earned from decades of frowning at spreadsheets and scowling at subordinates who missed their quarterly targets. His hair was completely white now, thinning on top. His eyes looked tired. No. Worse than tired. Hollow. The eyes of a man who'd won every battle and lost every war that mattered. He was wearing a $5,000 suit, Ermenegildo Zegna, custom-tailored, to sit alone in his house on Christmas Eve. The absurdity of it hit him like a slap. He dressed up for no one, put on expensive clothes to eat dinner by himself, maintained appearances for an audience that didn't exist. He thought about calling the suicide hotline. The thought materialized fully formed, startling in its clarity. He pulled out his phone, looked up the number. His finger hovered over the call button. But he couldn't do it. Couldn't admit that Harold Easton, master of the universe, captain of industry, winner of every accolade the business world offered, couldn't handle being alone on Christmas. His pride wouldn't allow it. Even now, even at rock bottom, even when he had nothing left to be proud of, he locked his phone, walked back to the dining room. The food was completely cold now, the once perfect prime rib congealing in its own juices. He should throw it away, should clear the table. Instead, he picked up the bottle of scotch he'd opened earlier. Macallan 25, $700 a bottle. He poured 3 fingers into a crystal tumbler with shaking hands. The liquid sloshed over the rim, pooling on the table's polished surface. He didn't bother wiping it up. What was the point? Who was going to see? He raised the glass to his lips, and the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. Harold froze, the glass halfway to his mouth. The doorbell rang again. Insistent. He set down the glass and stood slowly, his heart beginning to pound in a way that made his chest feel tight. Who could be at his door? It was 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve. The gates were closed. Locked. You needed a code to get through. His mind raced through possibilities. Emergency services? Had something happened? Had there been an accident? Or maybe Dylan had changed his mind. Maybe his son had driven here, had stood outside those gates, and decided tonight was the night to bury the 3 years of silence. Maybe Vanessa had realized she missed her father despite everything. Maybe they'd come together, a Christmas miracle, a chance to fix what he'd broken. Hope surged through Harold's chest, painful and desperate and terrifying. He hadn't realized how much he'd been wanting this until the possibility dangled in front of him like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. He rushed to the door, his hand on the ornate brass handle, and pulled it open, cold air hitting his face along with snow that had started falling. And there, standing on his doorstep under the porch light that illuminated the swirling snowflakes, were not his children. Not Dylan or Vanessa, or anyone he recognized. Instead, he saw a young man, maybe mid-30s, wearing a worn brown jacket that looked inadequate for the weather. Snow dusted his dark hair and shoulders. His face was exhausted, lined with worry and cold. And in his arms, wrapped in his jacket, pressed against his chest for warmth, was a little girl. Maybe 7 years old. Blonde hair in messy braids. Bright blue eyes wide with cold and fear. Her lips had a faint blue tinge. She was shivering violently. They were both strangers. Complete strangers. Standing in the snow outside his door at nearly midnight on Christmas Eve. And the young man looked at Harold with an expression that mixed desperation and hope and apology all at once, and said, "Please, sir. I'm sorry to bother you. Our truck broke down about a mile from here. We've been walking in the cold. My daughter. She's freezing. I just need to use your phone. Please. If you've ever felt invisible to the people you love, if you know what it's like when success costs you everything that actually matters, subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller because this story is going to take you on a journey. And if you're not going to subscribe, at least tell me in the comments why you're holding back. I genuinely want to know what's stopping you from joining this community where we tell stories that matter." Harold stood there in the doorway, cold air rushing past him into the warm house, staring at these two strangers on his doorstep. The young man's name was Nathan. He'd learn later, but in that moment he was just a desperate father holding a freezing child. Nathan shifted the little girl in his arms, trying to shield her from the wind that had picked up, sending snow swirling around them like a snow globe someone had shaken too hard. The girl's face was pressed against her father's chest, her small body trembling in waves that Harold could see even from where he stood. Her coat was too thin, too small really, the kind you'd find at a discount store, and it was doing almost nothing against the December cold that had dropped to somewhere around 15 degrees. Nathan's truck had broken down about a mile back down the road, he explained quickly, his words coming out in visible puffs of white breath. They'd been driving for hours, trying to get to his sister's place 3 hours north, when the engine just died. No warning. Just stopped. He tried to restart it, checked under the hood with the flashlight on his phone, but he didn't know enough about engines to diagnose the problem in the dark on the side of a country road. And his phone had no signal out there. He tried calling for help, had held the phone up in different directions like that might somehow pull a signal out of thin air, but nothing. 0 bars. So he'd made the decision to walk, to find help, to get his daughter somewhere warm. They'd been walking for 30 minutes through snow that was getting heavier by the minute, following the road because it was the only path he could see. Then he'd spotted the lights from Harold's mansion through the trees. The only lights for miles. A beacon in the darkness. He'd carried his daughter the whole way, her weight in his arms reminding him with every step that he had to keep going, had to find shelter, had to protect the only family he had left. Her name was Sophie, and her lips had gone from pink to blue somewhere during that walk, and Nathan knew enough to know that was dangerous, that hypothermia didn't mess around, that children could go downhill fast and cold like this. Harold's first instinct was to close the door. The thought came automatically, born from decades of careful boundaries and cultivated suspicion. He built an empire by being cautious, by never making a move without calculating every angle, by assuming everyone wanted something from him until proven otherwise. And here were two complete strangers showing up at his locked estate at midnight with a convenient sob story. Broken truck, freezing child, no phone signal. It hit every emotional button, didn't it? The cynic in him, the part that had survived corporate warfare and hostile takeovers, immediately questioned the timing, the coincidence of it all. What if this was a setup? What if the moment he let them inside, 3 more men came rushing from the darkness? What if they were con artists who'd researched him, knew he lived alone, knew he was elderly and vulnerable? The headlines flashed through his mind. Elderly billionaire robbed in his home. Trusting fool taken advantage of. His hand actually started to move toward closing the door, his mouth opening to say he was sorry but he couldn't help, that they should try the neighbor down the road, even though he knew there was no neighbor for another 2 miles. But then the little girl lifted her head from her father's chest and looked at him. Her eyes were the brightest blue Harold had ever seen, made even more vivid by the cold that had brought tears to the corners. She looked terrified, not in a performative way, not like she was acting for his benefit. Just genuinely, bone-deep scared in the way children get when they don't understand why the adults can't fix things. And something about her face, the shape of it, the way her blonde hair fell around her cheeks, reminded Harold so viscerally of Vanessa at that age that he actually felt his chest constrict. Vanessa had looked at him like that once, when she was maybe 6 or 7, when she'd gotten lost at the shopping mall, and Harold had finally found her standing by the information desk, crying. That same expression of relief mixed with residual fear, of desperately needing to trust that the adult in front of her would make things okay. The little girl's lips trembled, whether from cold or fear or both, Harold couldn't tell. And then she whispered, her voice, so small he almost didn't hear it over the wind. "Please, sir." 2 words. That was all it took. Something cracked open inside Harold's chest, something he'd kept carefully sealed for years. Decades of distrust, of careful boundaries, of protecting himself from being used or manipulated. All of it suddenly seemed ridiculous standing face to face with a freezing child who just needed help. What kind of man had he become that his first thought was to close the door on a 7-year-old girl turning blue in the snow? What did it say about him that he'd even hesitated? He stepped back from the doorway, pulling the door wide open. "Come in," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Quickly, before you both freeze to death out there." Harold led them through the grand foyer, suddenly seeing his house through their eyes. The massive Christmas tree that probably cost more than their truck. The chandelier overhead that threw prismatic light across marble floors. The artwork on the walls, the fresh flowers in crystal vases that his service refreshed twice, weekly, even though he never looked at them. Nathan seemed to barely notice any of it, his focus entirely on his daughter, but Harold noticed him noticing, if that made sense. Saw the way Nathan's jaw tightened slightly, the way his shoulders squared like he was bracing himself against feeling small. Harold recognized that particular brand of pride because he'd spent his whole life on the other side of it, watching people react to his wealth with varying degrees of comfort. He brought them to the living room where he'd lit a fire earlier that evening in a moment of pathetic optimism, thinking maybe the crackling flames would make the emptiness feel less oppressive. Now he was grateful for it. The fireplace was one of those massive stone affairs, big enough to roast a whole pig in, and the fire he'd built was still going strong. Nathan immediately moved toward it, but Harold stopped him. "Wait, let me get a blanket. If you warm up too fast after being that cold, it can be dangerous." He disappeared into the hallway closet and returned with a thick wool blanket, the kind his decorator had probably picked because it looked good draped over the back of a chair, not because anyone would actually use it. He wrapped it around Sophie, who Nathan had finally set down on the leather sofa. The girl was still shivering, her teeth chattering, so hard Harold could hear it. Her fingers, when he saw them, were pale, almost white at the tips. Nathan knelt in front of her, rubbing her hands gently between his own, trying to bring warmth back into them. "We just need to use your phone," Nathan said, not looking up from his daughter, his voice carrying that particular tone of forced casual that meant he was anything but. "I'll call a tow truck, get someone out there to look at the vehicle. We won't take up much of your time. I really appreciate you letting us in." Harold watched him, noted the way Nathan wouldn't quite meet his eyes, the way he was already planning his exit before he'd even fully arrived. Pride. Harold knew it intimately. It was the same pride that had kept him from calling Dylan, from reaching out to Vanessa, from admitting he needed anyone or anything. The same pride that had him sitting alone on Christmas Eve rather than swallowing his ego and apologizing to his children. And here was this young man, clearly desperate, clearly at the end of his rope, still trying to minimize his presence, still trying to pretend he needed less help than he obviously did. Harold noticed other things, too. The way Nathan's jacket had patches sewn onto the elbows, done neatly but clearly by hand, probably by Nathan himself. The way his boots were worn down at the heels. The way Sophie's coat, too small and too thin, had a button missing at the collar. These weren't people playing at poverty for sympathy. These were people holding on by their fingernails, trying to maintain dignity while everything fell apart around them. "Let me make some hot chocolate," Harold said, the words surprising him as much as they seemed to surprise Nathan. "The girl needs to warm up from the inside, too." He went to the kitchen, that massive chef's kitchen with its commercial-grade appliances and granite countertops, and realized he had no idea where anything was. Maria did all the cooking, prepared his meals, and left them with reheating instructions. He opened cabinets at random, found china he'd never used, crystal he'd never touched, and finally, in a cabinet near the stove, actual food. He found a tin of expensive hot chocolate mix, the kind that cost $20 for a small container, and read the instructions on the back like they were written in a foreign language. He heated milk in a small pan, the way the instructions indicated, whisked in the chocolate powder with more force than was probably necessary, and poured it into a mug that was probably fine-boned china and worth more than he wanted to think about. He found marshmallows in the pantry, added a handful to the top, and carried it back to the living room, feeling absurdly proud of himself for managing this simple task. Sophie had stopped shivering quite so violently, the blanket and the fire doing their work. When Harold handed her the mug, wrapping her small cold hands around it carefully, she looked up at him with those impossibly blue eyes and took a sip. Her expression transformed. It was subtle, but Harold caught it. The slight widening of her eyes, the way her lips parted in surprise. She took another sip, more eagerly this time, and something about her face told Harold that she'd never tasted hot chocolate like this before. Probably used to the watery kind from packets, mixed with tap water. This was real, rich, the kind made with whole milk and premium chocolate. The kind that probably cost more per cup than most people spent on a whole tin of the cheap stuff. She didn't say anything, but she looked at her father with an expression that seemed to ask, "Can I really drink this?" Nathan nodded at her, and she returned to sipping it slowly, savoring each taste like it might disappear if she rushed. Nathan finally sat down on the edge of the sofa, as far from Sophie as the furniture would allow, like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. Harold sat in the armchair across from them, the fire crackling between them, and waited. For a minute, maybe two, nobody said anything. Just the sound of Sophie sipping her hot chocolate and the pop and hiss of burning wood. Then Nathan started talking, and once he started, the story came out in pieces, fragments that Harold had to assemble into a coherent picture. Nathan's wife had died 8 months ago. Car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car broadside while she was coming home from the grocery store. She died at the scene. Nathan had been at work, had gotten the call from the police, had driven to the hospital thinking surely there was some mistake, surely they had the wrong person. But they hadn't. Her name had been Rachel, and she'd been 32 years old, and in an instant she'd just stopped existing. Left behind Nathan and Sophie and a whole future that would never happen now. Sophie had been at school when it happened. Nathan had to pick her up early, had to sit her down in the principal's office, and tell his 7-year-old daughter that Mommy wasn't coming home. She'd stopped talking for 2 weeks, just completely shut down, silent as a stone. She talked now, but not like she used to. Not with that easy chattiness that kids have. She'd become careful with her words, like she'd learned the hard way that life could change in a sentence. Nathan had tried to hold it together, had gone back to his job as a construction foreman because they needed the money, because staying busy was better than sitting still with grief. But the company had been struggling, and 2 weeks ago they'd announced layoffs. Last hired, first fired, except Nathan had been there for 6 years. Didn't matter. Downsizing meant downsizing. They'd given him 2 weeks severance and a handshake and wished him luck. He'd been looking for work, but it was December, and construction slowed down in December, and nobody was hiring. He'd burned through their savings keeping the rent paid, keeping food on the table, keeping Sophie in clothes that she was growing out of faster than he could replace them. His sister had offered to let them stay with her family for Christmas, had sent gas money so they could make the drive. It was supposed to be a fresh start. New town, new opportunities, Sophie spending time with her cousins, getting to be a kid again instead of walking on eggshells around her grieving father. They'd left that morning, all their important belongings packed into the truck, ready for whatever came next. And then the truck had died. Just like that. His last $200 were supposed to get them to his sister's place, with enough left over for gas money back to look for work after the holidays. Now the truck was sitting dead on the side of the road, and Nathan had no idea how much it would cost to fix, if it could even be fixed, if they'd be spending that $200 on a tow truck instead of a future. Sophie had barely said 10 words since her mother died, he told Harold. Barely engaged with anything. She used to love drawing, used to make up elaborate stories for her stuffed animals. Now she just clutched that worn bunny and stared at nothing. Harold listened to all of this and felt something shifting inside him, some calculus he'd been running his entire life suddenly producing different answers. He glanced at the clock on the mantel. 12:17 a.m. Christmas Day now. He knew, with absolute certainty, that no tow truck company was going to answer their phones at 12:17 a.m. on Christmas morning. Even if they did, they'd charge triple rates, maybe quadruple. Emergency holiday call-out fee. And Nathan had $200. That wouldn't even cover getting the truck towed to a garage, never mind diagnosing the problem, fixing it, getting them back on the road. Harold could call his private mechanic, the man who maintained his collection of vintage cars that sat in the garage gathering dust. Could probably get him out here within a few hours with the right financial incentive. But to what end? So Nathan and Sophie could get back in that truck and drive through the night, both of them exhausted and traumatized, to impose on his sister's family who probably had their own financial struggles? Harold watched Sophie's eyes start to droop, the warmth and the hot chocolate and the sheer exhaustion of the evening catching up with her. She was fighting it, trying to stay awake, but her head kept nodding forward. Nathan noticed, reached over to gently take the now empty mug from her hands before she could drop it. She curled into the corner of the sofa, pulling the blanket tight around herself, and within 2 minutes she was asleep. Out completely. Her face in sleep looked peaceful in a way it probably hadn't looked in 8 months. Nathan sat there staring at his daughter with an expression Harold recognized. The look of a parent who would do anything, sacrifice anything, become anyone necessary to protect their child. The look Harold should have had more often when Dylan and Vanessa were young, but had been too busy chasing the next deal to properly cultivate. Nathan looked defeated, bone-tired, like he'd been running on empty for so long he'd forgotten what full felt like. Like he was out of options and out of answers, and barely holding himself together for his daughter's sake. Harold made a decision that surprised him even as he heard himself speaking the words. "You'll stay here tonight," he said. "Both of you. If this story is hitting you in the feels, make sure you're subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller, because tomorrow we're releasing another story that'll wreck you emotionally in the best way. And hey, if you're lurking without subscribing, drop a comment telling me why. Do you not like emotional stories? Are you just browsing? I'm genuinely curious about what's holding you back from this community." Nathan looked at Harold like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. "Sir, we can't. We'll just call the tow truck. We'll figure something out. You've already done enough letting us warm up." But Harold shook his head, surprised by how certain he felt about this, how much he needed them to stay, even though he couldn't quite articulate why. It's past midnight on Christmas morning. No one's answering a tow truck line right now, and even if they did, they'd charge you triple rates for an emergency holiday call. Your daughter is exhausted. You're exhausted. You'll stay here tonight, get some rest, and we'll deal with the truck situation in the morning when you're both thinking clearly. Nathan opened his mouth to protest again, but Harold held up a hand. "I have 17 bedrooms in this house. 17. And every single one of them is empty. Let me do this. Please." There was something in the way Harold said that last word, something almost desperate, that made Nathan close his mouth and nod slowly. Harold showed them to one of the guest suites on the second floor, a room with its own bathroom and a bed big enough for both of them. Nathan carried Sophie, who barely stirred, and Harold left them there with towels and toiletries and a promise that he'd see them in the morning. Then he walked back downstairs, poured himself another glass of that expensive scotch, and found himself standing in front of the fireplace, staring at the family photo on the mantel. The one from 30 years ago. Patricia, Dylan, Vanessa and him. All of them smiling. All of them looking happy. Like a family that had it all figured out. What a lie that photograph was. Harold had been 38 years old when that photo was taken, and he'd been building something he thought would last forever. Not just a business, but an empire. He'd started with one property, a rundown apartment complex he bought at auction with borrowed money and sweat equity, and turned it into something profitable. Then 2 properties. Then 5. Then 20. Real estate development, property management, commercial holdings. By the time he was 40, he had enough money to be comfortable. By 45, he was wealthy. By 50, he was genuinely rich. And he couldn't stop. Didn't want to stop. Every new deal was a rush. Every acquisition a victory. Every quarterly earnings report a validation that he was doing something right, building something meaningful. Patricia had been beautiful back then, with dark hair that fell to her shoulders and a laugh that could fill a room. She believed in him at the beginning, had supported his ambitions, had understood that building something took sacrifice. They'd married young, had Dylan when Harold was 28 and Patricia was 26, had Vanessa 3 years later. And Harold had promised her, over and over, that the crazy hours were temporary. Just one more year of 16-hour days. Just one more year of missing dinner and working weekends and bringing paperwork home at night. Just one more year, and then he'd slow down, delegate more, actually be present for the family he was supposedly building this empire for. One more year became 2. Became 5. Became 10. Became 20. Patricia stopped believing the promises somewhere around year 7, Harold thought. Stopped asking him to come to family dinners because the disappointment was worse than his absence. Stopped planning vacations because he'd just cancel them at the last minute for some emergency that absolutely required his immediate attention. Stopped expecting him to remember birthdays and anniversaries without his assistant reminding him. She'd adapted, learn to run the household, and raise the children essentially as a single parent who just happened to be married. And Harold had told himself that was fine, that she understood, that she knew he was doing this for them. For their future, for their security. Except he'd been lying to himself. Dylan's 10th birthday party. Harold could still see it in his mind with perfect clarity, even though it had been 40 years ago. Even though he hadn't actually been there to see it. Patricia had planned it for weeks, had sent out invitations to Dylan's entire class, had decorated the backyard with baseball-themed decorations because that's what Dylan was into that year. Little League. He'd been pretty good, apparently. Harold wouldn't know, because he'd never made it to a game. The party was on a Saturday afternoon in June. Beautiful weather. Patricia had hired a magician, had set up carnival games, had made Dylan's favorite chocolate cake from scratch. Dylan had asked Harold 3 times that week if he'd be there. Had stood in Harold's home office doorway in his pajamas the night before and said, "You're going to come tomorrow, right, Dad? You promised." And Harold had promised. Had fully intended to be there. Had blocked out the afternoon on his calendar. Had told his assistant no meetings after noon. But then Gerald Thornton had called that morning. Gerald, who was selling a strip mall property that Harold had been eyeing for months. And Gerald said he had another buyer interested. And if Harold wanted to make an offer, he needed to come look at it today, right now, this afternoon, or the deal was off the table. And Harold had gone. Had kissed Patricia on the cheek and told her he'd be back in a few hours. Probably wouldn't even miss the cake. Had driven to meet Gerald and walked the property and negotiated terms while his son stood in the backyard surrounded by his friends, watching the driveway, waiting for his father to arrive. Harold had gotten home at 7 that evening. The party was long over. The decorations were already taken down. Dylan was in his room, and when Harold went upstairs to apologize, to explain, his son had looked at him with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. Disappointment. Resignation. Like he'd expected this. Like he'd known all along that his father wouldn't show up, and had been stupid to hope otherwise. Patricia hadn't yelled at him. Hadn't said a word, actually. Just looked at him with tired eyes and went to bed early. And Harold had told himself it wasn't that big a deal. It was one birthday party. There would be others. He'd make it to the next one. Except he didn't make it to the next one either. Or the one after that. The warnings had come from every direction, and Harold had ignored all of them. Patricia begging him, actually begging him with tears in her eyes, to please just come to dinner, to sit with them for one meal without his phone or his laptop or his mind on the next deal. To just be present for 1 hour. Vanessa's 3rd-grade teacher calling to say that Vanessa was acting out in class, seeking attention in negative ways. And could they schedule a parent-teacher conference because there seemed to be something going on at home? Harold had sent Patricia to that conference. Dylan at 14, skinny and awkward in that way teenage boys get, standing in the kitchen after school and saying with unexpected venom, "Why do you even bother coming home? You're never really here anyway." And Harold had responded, had actually thought he was being reassuring when he'd said, "I'm building your future. I'm making sure you and your sister never have to worry about money, never have to struggle the way I did. Someday you'll understand. Someday you'll thank me." But they never did thank him. Dylan hadn't struggled financially, that was true. He'd gone to the best schools, worn the best clothes, driven a nice car. He'd also barely known his father. Had grown up with a man who was physically present maybe 15% of the time and emotionally present almost never. Vanessa had been the same. Dance recitals her father never attended. School plays where she looked for him in the audience and found an empty seat. Her high school graduation where Harold had shown up but spent the entire ceremony on his phone, closing a deal while his daughter crossed the stage and accepted her diploma. He believed, genuinely believed, that providing for them financially was the same as loving them. That the big house and the good schools and the trust funds he'd set up meant he was being a good father. That presence and attention were somehow less important than the zeros in their bank accounts. He'd been so catastrophically wrong. Patricia's cancer diagnosis came on a Tuesday. Harold remembered it being a Tuesday because he'd had a board meeting that morning, remembered checking his watch during her phone call, and calculating how much time he had before he needed to be downtown for the afternoon session. She'd found a lump, gone to the doctor, had a biopsy. Breast cancer. Stage 3. Aggressive. They'd caught it, but just barely. She would need surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. The works. Her voice on the phone had been shaking, and Harold had immediately gone into problem-solving mode because that's what he did. That's what he was good at. He'd called the best oncologists in the country, had gotten her appointments at the top cancer centers, had arranged consultations with specialists who normally had 6-month waiting lists. He'd thrown money at the problem with both hands, like money was a weapon he could use to beat the cancer into submission. And Patricia had let him make the calls, had gone to the appointments, had followed the treatment plans. But what she'd asked for, what she'd actually needed, was him. Just him. There. Present. Holding her hand. Her first chemotherapy appointment was on a Thursday. Harold was in London that week, finalizing the acquisition of a commercial property portfolio. Patricia had called him the night before and asked, voice small, if he could be there with her. She was scared. The doctors had explained the side effects, the nausea, the fatigue, how sick she'd probably feel. She didn't want to go alone. Harold had checked his calendar, had looked at the meeting scheduled for Thursday, had calculated the cost of flying back early. And he'd said he couldn't make it. This deal was too important. Too many moving pieces. He couldn't leave in the middle of negotiations. But he'd arranged for his assistant, Margaret Vale, to go with her instead. Margaret was wonderful, he'd assured Patricia. She'd take good care of her. Patricia had been quiet on the line for a long moment, and then she'd said okay and hung up. She stopped asking after that. Stopped calling him at the hospital. Stopped requesting. He visit during the bad days when the chemo made her so sick she couldn't get out of bed. Margaret became her companion through the treatments, Margaret who sat with her and held her hand and watched terrible daytime television with her while Harold was across the country or across the world, building his empire. Patricia had made it through the treatments, had survived. The cancer went into remission. But something in their marriage had died during those months, something that couldn't be revived with apologies or belated attention or expensive gifts. She'd become polite with him, distant, like a hotel guest interacting with management. They lived in the same house but existed in separate worlds. 10 years ago, Patricia had been at a routine follow-up appointment when the cancer came back. It had metastasized, spread to her bones, her liver, her lungs. Stage 4. Terminal. They gave her 6 months, maybe a year with aggressive treatment. She'd lived for 8 months. Harold had arranged for the best palliative care, had converted one of the guest rooms into a hospital suite with everything she might need, had hired round-the-clock nurses, had paid for experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, had done everything except the one thing she wanted, which was for him to sit with her, to talk to her, to reminisce about the early days when they'd been happy and in love and the world had seemed full of possibility, to just be her husband instead of her medical manager. Margaret had been there almost every day. Dylan and Vanessa had visited, though their visits had been marked by tension and long silences. And Harold had reviewed paperwork at her bedside, had taken calls in the hallway outside her room, had been present in body but absent in every way that mattered. Patricia's funeral was held on a gray October day at the church they'd been married in 35 years earlier. Harold had given the eulogy, had stood at the podium, and talked about her strength, her grace, her dedication to their family. Had made it sound like a business presentation, all facts and accomplishments and sanitized memories. He'd noticed Dylan sitting in the front pew getting more and more rigid as Harold spoke, his jaw clenched so tight Harold could see it from the podium. Halfway through the eulogy, Dylan had simply stood up and walked out. Just left. Walked down the center aisle while Harold was mid-sentence, pushed through the church doors, and didn't come back. The congregation had shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Harold had paused, watched his son leave, and then continued reading from his prepared remarks like nothing had happened. Vanessa had stayed for the whole service, had stood in the receiving line afterward and accepted condolences with a frozen smile, but she hadn't looked at Harold once. Hadn't spoken to him. When he tried to approach her after everyone had left, tried to put a hand on her shoulder, she flinched away like his touch burned her. He'd paid for everything. The best casket money could buy, the massive flower arrangements, the catered reception at an expensive restaurant, the memorial video with professional editing. He'd written checks and made arrangements and handled all the logistics because that's what he knew how to do. And he hadn't understood why his children were so angry with him. He'd done everything right, hadn't he? He provided the best for their mother, both in life and in death. What more did they want from him? Nathan looked at Harold like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. Sir, we can't. We'll just call the tow truck. We'll figure something out. You've already done enough letting us warm up. But Harold shook his head, surprised by how certain he felt about this, how much he needed them to stay, even though he couldn't quite articulate why. It's past midnight on Christmas morning. No one's answering a tow truck line right now, and even if they did, they'd charge you triple rates for an emergency holiday call. Your daughter is exhausted. You're exhausted. You'll stay here tonight, get some rest, and we'll deal with the truck situation in the morning when you're both thinking clearly. Nathan opened his mouth to protest again, but Harold held up a hand. I have 17 bedrooms in this house. 17. And every single one of them is empty. Let me do this. Please. There was something in the way Harold said that last word, something almost desperate, that made Nathan close his mouth and nod slowly. Harold showed them to one of the guest suites on the second floor, a room with its own bathroom, and a bed big enough for both of them. Nathan carried Sophie, who barely stirred, and Harold left them there with towels and toiletries and a promise that he'd see them in the morning. Then he walked back downstairs, poured himself another glass of that expensive scotch, and found himself standing in front of the fireplace, staring at the family photo on the mantel. The one from 30 years ago. Patricia, Dylan, Vanessa and him. All of them smiling. All of them looking happy. Like a family that had it all figured out. What a lie that photograph was. Harold had been 38 years old when that photo was taken, and he'd been building something he thought would last forever. Not just a business, but an empire. He'd started with one property, a rundown apartment complex he bought at auction with borrowed money and sweat equity, and turned it into something profitable. Then 2 properties. Then 5. Then 20. Real estate development, property management, commercial holdings. By the time he was 40, he had enough money to be comfortable. By 45, he was wealthy. By 50, he was genuinely rich. And he couldn't stop. Didn't want to stop. Every new deal was a rush. Every acquisition a victory. Every quarterly earnings report a validation that he was doing something right, building something meaningful. Patricia had been beautiful back then, with dark hair that fell to her shoulders and a laugh that could fill a room. She believed in him at the beginning, had supported his ambitions, had understood that building something took sacrifice. They'd married young, had Dylan when Harold was 28 and Patricia was 26, had Vanessa 3 years later. And Harold had promised her, over and over, that the crazy hours were temporary. Just one more year of 16-hour days. Just one more year of missing dinner and working weekends and bringing paperwork home at night. Just one more year, and then he'd slow down, delegate more, actually be present for the family he was supposedly building this empire for. One more year became 2. Became 5. Became 10. Became 20. Patricia stopped believing the promises somewhere around year 7, Harold thought. Stopped asking him to come to family dinners because the disappointment was worse than his absence. Stopped planning vacations because he'd just cancel them at the last minute for some emergency that absolutely required his immediate attention. Stopped expecting him to remember birthdays and anniversaries without his assistant reminding him. She'd adapted, learned to run the household, and raise the children essentially as a single parent who just happened to be married. And Harold had told himself that was fine, that she understood, that she knew he was doing this for them. For their future. For their security. Except he'd been lying to himself. Dylan's 10th birthday party. Harold could still see it in his mind with perfect clarity, even though it had been 40 years ago. Even though he hadn't actually been there to see it. Patricia had planned it for weeks, had sent out invitations to Dylan's entire class, had decorated the backyard with baseball-themed decorations because that's what Dylan was into that year. Little League. He'd been pretty good, apparently. Harold wouldn't know, because he'd never made it to a game. The party was on a Saturday afternoon in June. Beautiful weather. Patricia had hired a magician, had set up carnival games, had made Dylan's favorite chocolate cake from scratch. Dylan had asked Harold 3 times that week if he'd be there. Had stood in Harold's home office doorway in his pajamas the night before and said, "You're going to come tomorrow, right, Dad? You promised." And Harold had promised. Had fully intended to be there. Had blocked out the afternoon on his calendar, had told his assistant no meetings after noon. But then Gerald Thornton had called that morning, Gerald, who was selling a strip mall property that Harold had been eyeing for months, and Gerald said he had another buyer interested, and if Harold wanted to make an offer he needed to come look at it today, right now, this afternoon, or the deal was off the table. And Harold had gone, had kissed Patricia on the cheek and told her he'd be back in a few hours, probably wouldn't even miss the cake, had driven to meet Gerald and walked the property and negotiated terms while his son stood in the backyard surrounded by his friends, watching the driveway, waiting for his father to arrive. Harold had gotten home at 7 that evening. The party was long over. The decorations were already taken down. Dylan was in his room, and when Harold went upstairs to apologize to explain, his son had looked at him with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. Disappointment. Resignation. Like he'd expected this. Like he'd known all along that his father wouldn't show up, and had been stupid to hope otherwise. Patricia hadn't yelled at him. Hadn't said a word, actually. Just looked at him with tired eyes and went to bed early. And Harold had told himself it wasn't that big a deal. It was one birthday party. There would be others. He'd make it to the next one. Except he didn't make it to the next one either. Or the one after that. The warnings had come from every direction, and Harold had ignored all of them. Patricia begging him, actually begging him with tears in her eyes, to please just come to dinner, to sit with them for one meal without his phone or his laptop or his mind on the next deal. To just be present for 1 hour. Vanessa's third-grade teacher calling to say that Vanessa was acting out in class, seeking attention in negative ways, and could they schedule a parent-teacher conference because there seemed to be something going on at home? Harold had sent Patricia to that conference. Dylan at 14, skinny and awkward in that way teenage boys get, standing in the kitchen after school and saying with unexpected venom, "Why do you even bother coming home? You're never really here anyway." And Harold had responded, had actually thought he was being reassuring when he'd said, "I'm building your future. I'm making sure you and your sister never have to worry about money, never have to struggle the way I did. Someday you'll understand. Someday you'll thank me." But they never did thank him. Dylan hadn't struggled financially, that was true. He'd gone to the best schools, worn the best clothes, driven a nice car. He'd also barely known his father. Had grown up with a man who was physically present maybe 15% of the time and emotionally present almost never. Vanessa had been the same. Dance recitals her father never attended. School plays where she looked for him in the audience and found an empty seat. Her high school graduation where Harold had shown up but spent the entire ceremony on his phone, closing a deal while his daughter crossed the stage and accepted her diploma. He believed, genuinely believed, that providing for them financially was the same as loving them. That the big house and the good schools and the trust funds he'd set up meant he was being a good father. That presence and attention were somehow less important than the zeros in their bank accounts. He'd been so catastrophically wrong. Nathan's question hung in the air between them like something physical, something Harold could almost reach out and touch. Did they want those things? Or did they just want you? It was such a simple question. So devastatingly simple. And Harold didn't have an answer. Or rather, he did have an answer, and it was the one he'd spent 3 decades avoiding. They'd wanted him. Of course they'd wanted him. What child doesn't want their father? What child cares about trust funds and Ivy League educations if it means growing up with a ghost in a suit who occasionally appears at the dinner table? Harold had spent 40 years believing that providing was the same as loving, that his presence in their bank accounts could substitute for his presence in their lives. And he'd been wrong. Catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. He looked at Nathan, this young man who'd lost everything except the one thing that mattered, and saw what he should have been. Nathan had nothing. No job, no money, a broken truck, an uncertain future. But he had Sophie, and Sophie had him, and the bond between them was so solid you could practically see it. Nathan would walk through a blizzard for his daughter, would carry her for miles, would swallow his pride and knock on a stranger's door at midnight, would do whatever it took, because she was what mattered, not the money he didn't have, not the opportunities he couldn't provide, just her, just being there. Harold had had everything and had chosen to be nowhere. Nathan had nothing and chose to be everywhere his daughter needed him. The contrast was so stark it felt like a physical blow. Harold didn't sleep much that night. He lay in his massive bed in his master suite that was bigger than most people's entire apartments and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of people in his house. Real people. Not staff who arrived at 8 and left at 5, but actual human beings who were sleeping under his roof because they needed shelter and he provided it. He could hear the faint sound of Nathan moving around in the guest room, probably checking on Sophie, making sure she was warm enough, comfortable enough. The sounds of fatherhood. The sounds Harold's own children had probably listened for and never heard because he'd always been in his office or on a plane or at a meeting. Somewhere else. Anywhere else. When morning came, Harold woke to something he hadn't heard in years. Sounds from the kitchen. Actual cooking sounds. The clatter of pans, the opening and closing of cabinets, the faint hum of someone who didn't realize they were humming. He put on his robe, that ridiculous silk thing that cost $800, and walked downstairs, following the smell of something that wasn't prepared by his housekeeper and left in the refrigerator with reheating instructions. The kitchen was a disaster, and it was the most beautiful thing Harold had seen in years. Nathan stood at the stove flipping pancakes, having apparently raided Harold's pantry, and found the ingredients that Maria kept stocked even though Harold never used them. Flour on the counter, eggshells by the sink, a mixing bowl with batter residue. Mess. Glorious, lived in mess. And at the kitchen table, Sophie sat with a box of crayons Harold didn't even know he owned and a pad of paper, drawing with the intense concentration that children bring to their art. She was humming the same tune Nathan had been humming, something soft and familiar that Harold thought might be a Christmas carol. She looked up when Harold entered, and she smiled. An actual smile. Nathan noticed and turned from the stove. "Sorry," he said quickly. "I hope you don't mind. Sophie was hungry and I found the stuff and I thought, well, we're already imposing, so we might as well make breakfast? That sounds terrible. I'm sorry, I should have asked first." But Harold was barely listening to Nathan's apology because he was staring at Sophie's drawing. She'd turned the paper around to show him, proud of her work. It was a picture of a man, drawn in that way children draw where the proportions are all wrong but the meaning is perfectly clear. A tall figure with white hair and a sad face. The nice sad man, she'd labeled it in careful crayon letters, some backwards, some not quite on the line. That's what she saw when she looked at him. Nice. And sad. A 7-year-old child had seen in 12 hours what Harold had been denying for years. Harold sat down at the kitchen table, heavily, feeling every one of his 78 years. Sophie pushed the drawing toward him. "You can keep it if you want," she said. "My mommy used to say that pictures make people feel better when they're sad." Nathan brought plates of pancakes to the table, slightly misshapen and probably not as good as Maria's would have been, but made with actual hands by an actual person in Harold's actual kitchen. They ate together, the three of them, at the kitchen table that Harold never used because he always ate in the dining room or in his office or not at all. Sophie told them about her favorite Christmas present ever, which had been a stuffed bunny her mother had given her 2 years ago, the same bunny she'd been clutching last night. Nathan told a story about the time his truck broke down in the rain, and he and Sophie had to wait 3 hours for a tow truck while playing I Spy to pass the time. Their life sounded hard, uncertain, marked by struggle and loss and making do with less. And it also sounded full in a way Harold's life had never been. Sophie looked at Harold across the table, those impossibly blue eyes studying him with the directness that only children possess, and she asked, "Why are you sad even though you're rich?" The question was so blunt, so innocent, so completely without guile that Harold didn't know how to deflect it with the usual pleasantries adults use to avoid uncomfortable truths. "I'm not sad," he said automatically, the lie sounding hollow even to his own ears. Sophie tilted her head, unconvinced. "You look sad. You have sad eyes. My daddy says money can't buy happy. Is that true?" Harold found himself nodding before he'd even decided to answer honestly. "Yes," he said. "That's true." Sophie considered this, taking another bite of pancake. Then she asked, "Do you have kids?" And Harold, who'd spent 3 years not talking about this with anyone, found himself telling this 7-year-old girl about Dylan and Vanessa. About how they were grown now, adults with their own lives. About how he hadn't spoken to them in years. About how he'd missed too much of their childhood, had been too focused on work, had prioritized the wrong things. Sophie listened with the serious attention children give to important matters, and when he finished, she asked simply, "Did you say sorry?" The question hit Harold like a physical blow. Had he said sorry? Had he ever actually apologized? He'd offered explanations, justifications, defenses of his choices. He'd gotten angry when they didn't understand that he'd been doing it all for them. He'd felt hurt by their rejection, wounded by their anger. But had he ever just said the words, "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I should have been there. I wasn't. That's on me"? The answer was no. He'd never said those words because saying them would mean admitting he'd failed, and Harold Easton didn't fail. Except he had. Spectacularly. And everyone knew it except him. If you're feeling the story, you need to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller because we post stories like this 3 times a week. Stories about redemption, second chances, and finding family in unexpected places. And if you're one of those people who watches but doesn't subscribe, seriously, what's the deal? Drop a comment explaining your reasoning, because I'm genuinely trying to understand the psychology here. After breakfast, Sophie asked if she could watch the Christmas parade on television, and Nathan set her up in the living room with blankets and the remote control, showing her how to find the channel. Then he came back to help Harold clean up the kitchen, and Harold realized he didn't actually know where half the things went because Maria always handled this. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, Nathan washing dishes, Harold drying them with a towel that still had the store creases in it because it had never been used. Nathan asked about the house, about how long Harold had lived here, and Harold found himself giving an impromptu tour. They walked through room after room, and with each space Harold showed him, Harold became more aware of how sterile everything was. The formal living room with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, arranged just so, every surface dust-free and untouched. The library with its leather-bound first editions that were investment pieces, not books anyone actually read. The sitting room, the sunroom, the game room with a pool table that had never been played on. Everything was expensive. Everything was beautiful. Nothing was personal. There were no family photos on the walls except that one formal portrait from 30 years ago. No children's artwork stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. No scuffed furniture from years of use. No worn spots on the carpet where people walked frequently. The house looked like a showroom, not a home. Nathan didn't say much as they walked, but Harold could see him taking it all in, and when they returned to the main hallway, Nathan said quietly, "Must be lonely." Not an accusation. Not pity. Just an observation. Must be lonely. And Harold realized that it was. Had been for years. He just stopped noticing because loneliness was like background noise. After a while you learned to tune it out. There was one room Harold hadn't shown Nathan. One door that stayed locked. It was at the end of the upstairs hallway, and Harold hadn't opened it in 8 years. Not since Patricia's funeral. But something about this morning, about Sophie's drawing and Nathan's presence and that simple question, "Did you say sorry?" made Harold reach into his pocket for the key he still carried. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, and the smell of the room hit him first. Dust and old paper and memories. The room was full of things he boxed up and couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bear to throw away. Dylan's Little League trophies lined one shelf, cheap plastic gold figures on fake marble bases. Vanessa's dance costumes hung in the closet, tutus and leotards in various sizes tracking her growth from tiny to teenager. Photo albums stacked on the desk, chronicling birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays that had seemed unremarkable at the time but were now irreplaceable. Patricia's paintings leaned against the wall, watercolors she'd done in the brief period when she'd taken art classes, when she tried to find something for herself beyond being a wife and mother to people who didn't appreciate her. Sophie had followed them upstairs, curious about where they'd gone, and she appeared in the doorway with wide eyes. "What's this room?" she asked. Harold's voice came out rough. "This is the room where I keep the people I lost." Sophie walked in carefully, looking around like she was in a museum. She saw the photo albums and asked if she could look, and Harold found himself nodding. She sat cross-legged on the floor and opened the top album, and Harold sat down next to her, his old knees protesting, and started turning pages. There was Dylan at 8, covered in mud from a soccer game. Vanessa at 6, missing her 2 front teeth, grinning at the camera. Patricia young and beautiful, holding baby Dylan in the hospital. Family vacations Harold had mostly missed. Christmas mornings where Harold appeared in maybe every third photo because he was usually the one taking the pictures, or more likely on a conference call. Sophie pointed to a photo of Dylan in his baseball uniform. "Is that your son?" she asked. Harold nodded. "He looks happy there." And he did. In that moment, captured by Patricia's camera, Dylan looked genuinely happy. Harold tried to remember if he'd been at that game. He didn't think so. Harold's phone buzzed in his pocket, the sound jarring in the quiet of the memory room. He pulled it out, saw an email notification. The sender's name made his heart sink. Whitmore and Associates, Dylan's lawyer. He opened it with a sense of dread that proved completely justified. It wasn't from Dylan. Of course it wasn't from Dylan. It was a formal legal notice, all official letterhead, and whereas and hereby. Dylan was contesting Patricia's will, claiming that Harold had manipulated Patricia while she was ill, had pressured her to structure the estate in ways that gave Harold continued control even after his death, demanding immediate distribution of Dylan's inheritance, accusing Harold of using the trust structure as a way to maintain power and control over his adult children. The language was cold, clinical, designed to hurt while maintaining professional distance. There was no personal message attached, no note from Dylan himself, just the legal machinery grinding forward, turning their broken relationship into a court case. Harold felt something break inside his chest. After everything he'd done, everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed. This is what it came to. His own son taking him to court, treating him like an adversary instead of a father. He stood up abruptly, the phone shaking in his hand, and Nathan must have seen something in his face because he was suddenly there asking if everything was all right. And Harold couldn't help it. The words exploded out of him. After everything I built for him, everything I gave him, this is how he repays me, taking me to court, accusing me of manipulating his mother. His voice was too loud in the quiet room, and he saw Sophie looking at him with startled eyes, but he couldn't stop. I gave him everything. Everything. And he treats me like I'm his enemy. Nathan listened without interrupting, and when Harold finally ran out of steam, when the anger drained away, leaving only hollow hurt, Nathan said quietly, "My father left when I was 12. The change of subject was so unexpected that Harold actually stopped spiraling. Nathan continued, "Just walked out one day. No explanation. No goodbye. Left my mom with 3 kids and a mortgage she couldn't afford alone. I grew up without him. Never had the things money could buy. Never went on vacations or had a college fund or any of that. But what killed me wasn't what we didn't have. It was that he chose not to be there. He chose to leave. And I spent years wondering if I'd done something wrong, if I'd been too much trouble, if I hadn't been good enough to make him want to stay." Nathan looked at Harold directly. "When Rachel died, when I became a single parent, I made myself a promise. My girl will never wonder if her daddy loves her. She'll never question whether I want to be here. We might not have money. We might struggle. But she'll know every single day that I chose her, that I'd choose her over everything. That's what kids need. Not trust funds, not opportunities, just to know they matter more than anything else." Harold felt the words land like physical blows. His children had wondered. Of course they'd wondered. They'd spent their whole childhood wondering if they mattered more than the next deal, the next acquisition, the next board meeting. And the answer had been no. They hadn't mattered more. They'd mattered, sure, in the abstract way parents love their children. But had they mattered more? Had Harold ever chosen them over his empire? The answer was staring him in the face, written in legal notices and 3 years of silence. Sophie's voice cut through Harold's thoughts. She'd been listening, picking up pieces of the adult conversation, and she asked Nathan with perfect childish directness, "Are we rich now? Because we're in this big house." Nathan smiled at her, pulled her close. "We're rich in what matters, sweetheart. We have each other." Sophie hugged him tight, her small arms wrapped around his waist, and said with absolute certainty, "I'm glad we're rich then." Harold watched this exchange and felt something shift inside him. His children had never said anything like that to him, had never hugged him with that kind of unself-conscious affection. They'd been too busy wondering if he loved them, too busy competing with his work for his attention, too busy learning to protect themselves from the disappointment of having a father who was always somewhere else. Harold looked down at his phone, at the legal notice still glowing on the screen. His first instinct had been to call his own lawyer, to fight back, To turn this into the battle Dylan seemed to want. But what would that prove? That he could win a court case. He'd won everything else in his life that could be won, and look where it had gotten him. Sitting alone in a mansion on Christmas Eve, he closed the email. Nathan was helping Sophie build a house of cards on the floor using an old deck they'd found in one of the boxes, and Harold heard himself asking, "If you could tell your father anything, what would it be?" Nathan didn't hesitate. That I needed him to show up, not send money. That being there was the only thing that mattered. That he missed out on knowing me, and that's his loss more than mine. Harold nodded slowly. He could still show up. It might be too late. The damage might be irreversible, but he could try. He could do what he should have done 3 years ago. 10 years ago. 30 years ago. He could show up. Actually show up. Not with his checkbook, or his lawyers, or his explanations. Just himself. Flawed and late, and carrying decades of mistakes. But present. Finally, devastatingly present. He watched Sophie carefully place another card on their wobbling structure, her tongue sticking out in concentration, and made a decision. He was going to write to his children. Not an email. Not a text. An actual letter. Something he hadn't done in 30 years, maybe longer. Something physical and real and slow. Something that required him to sit down and think about what he actually wanted to say instead of firing off quick responses between meetings. He was going to write to Dylan and to Vanessa, and he was going to say the things Sophie had made him realize he'd never said. Starting with sorry. Subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller if you believe in second chances, if you think it's never too late to become the person you should have been. And look, if you're still on the fence about subscribing, I need you to drop a comment telling me what would make you commit. Is it the story frequency? The content type? Help me understand what you need from this channel. Harold found stationery in his office, expensive cream-colored paper with his monogram embossed at the top, and realized immediately how pretentious it looked. How very on-brand for a man who turned everything into a status symbol. He found plain paper instead, the kind Maria used for grocery lists, and sat down at his desk with a pen. Dear Dylan. He stared at those 2 words for 10 minutes. What came next? How do you apologize for 30 years in a letter? How do you explain that you finally understand what you did wrong? He started writing, crossed it out, started again. The words felt inadequate, but he kept going because inadequate words were better than 30 more years of silence. He was still writing, still struggling to articulate decades of regret, when he heard Nathan's phone ring in the other room. Heard Nathan answer with a cheerful, "Hey, Lisa," that was clearly for Sophie's benefit. Heard the long pause. Heard Nathan's voice change, drop into something quieter, more controlled. Harold knew he should give Nathan privacy, should close his office door, but something about the tone made him freeze. He could hear Nathan walking away from Sophie, probably stepping into the hallway, and then his voice came clearer, strained with the effort of sounding calm. No, I totally understand. If Tom lost his job, you've got your own stuff to deal with. Don't worry about it. We'll figure something out. Another pause. Yeah, we're fine. Truck should be fixed by this afternoon. We'll head back home, regroup. Really, Lisa, it's okay. You take care of your family. We'll be fine. Harold heard the call end, heard the long exhale Nathan let out when he thought no one was listening, that sound of someone holding themselves together by sheer force of will. Harold stayed very still in his office, processing what he'd just heard. Nathan's sister couldn't take them in. Nathan's plan, his backup plan, his only plan, had just evaporated. And Nathan had $47 left. Harold had seen his wallet this morning when Nathan had pulled it out to show Sophie a photo of her mother, had glimpsed the thin collection of bills. Maybe $50. The truck repair would cost, what, $300 minimum? Maybe $500 depending on what was wrong. Nathan didn't have that. Didn't have anywhere to go after the truck was fixed. Was looking at homelessness in a matter of days, maybe hours. And he'd hidden it. Had told his sister they'd be fine with that same stubborn pride Harold recognized because he'd worn it like armor his entire life. The same pride that kept Harold from calling his children, from admitting he'd been wrong, from asking for help or connection or forgiveness. The same pride that had left him alone in a mansion on Christmas Eve. Nathan was about to make the same mistakes Harold had made, just from the opposite direction. Harold had pushed people away by never needing them. Nathan was about to push away help by refusing to admit he needed it. Different circumstances, same isolation. Sophie appeared in Harold's office doorway, and Harold quickly wiped his eyes, surprised to find them wet. When had he started crying? Sophie didn't comment on it, just climbed into the chair across from his desk and asked, "What did you wish for when you were a kid at Christmas?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, the way children's questions did, jumping from topic to topic with their own internal logic. Harold thought about lying, giving some sanitized answer about toys or games. But something about this morning, about everything that had happened in the past 18 hours, made him tell the truth. "I wish my father would notice me," he said. Sophie nodded like this made perfect sense. "Was he busy like you were?" Harold felt the words hit him squarely in the chest. "Yes," he said. "He was wealthy, always working, building his business. He never had time for me. I told myself I'd be different when I had kids." He paused, the irony so bitter he could taste it. "But I wasn't different. I did exactly the same thing to Dylan and Vanessa that my father did to me." Sophie considered this, swinging her legs from the chair that was too big for her. "My mommy used to say that grown-ups repeat stuff from when they were little unless they decide not to. She said you can break the circle if you're brave enough. You can break the circle." 8 years old and speaking wisdom, Harold had spent 78 years failing to understand. He was repeating his father's mistakes, and his children would probably repeat his, and the cycle would continue until someone had the courage to break it. Harold looked at the letter on his desk, the inadequate words he'd been struggling with. Maybe this was how you broke the circle, by being brave enough to say you were wrong. Harold found Nathan in the living room helping Sophie build another card house, and he said, "My property management company needs a site supervisor." Nathan looked up, immediately wary. "Mr. Easton, you don't have to." But Harold held up a hand. "I'm not offering you charity. I genuinely need someone. I've been too hands-off since retirement, and the managers I have in place are more concerned with keeping me happy than telling me the truth about what's happening on the ground. I need someone who knows construction, who can assess properties, who can tell me what actually needs fixing versus what the contractors are inflating. You're qualified. You have 6 years of experience as a foreman. It's a real job with a real salary." Nathan stood up slowly. "I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept something just because you feel sorry for us." Harold nodded. "You're right to be suspicious, and I'm going to be honest with you because you deserve honesty." He took a breath. "I'm trying to buy your friendship, and I know that's wrong. I've spent my entire life turning human connection into transactions because that's the only language I know. I buy things. I fix things with money. I don't know how to just be with people without owing them or them owing me." He saw Nathan's expression shift, surprise replacing suspicion. "But I'm asking you to help me learn. I'm asking you to teach me what I taught my children to forget, how to connect without conditions, how to be present without purchasing presents. I need that more than I need a site supervisor, if I'm being completely honest. And yes, I'm offering you a job because I want you to stay. Because in 18 hours you and Sophie made my house feel like a home for the first time in a decade. But it's also a real job that needs doing, and you're qualified, and if you decide you hate me after a month you can quit, and I'll give you a good reference." Nathan stared at him for a long moment. Harold could see him processing, weighing, trying to figure out if this was genuine or just a different kind of manipulation. Finally Nathan said, "Interview for it. After the holidays. No promises. And if I take it, I pay rent for wherever Sophie and I stay. Fair market rate." Harold wanted to argue, wanted to say they could stay in the mansion for free, but he saw the steel in Nathan's eyes and understood that Nathan needed this boundary, needed to maintain some independence. "Fair enough," Harold said. They shook on it, and Harold felt something like hope stirring in his chest. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he could still learn. Maybe broken circles could be mended. His phone rang then, the sound cutting through the moment. Harold glanced at the screen and felt his heart stop. Vanessa, his daughter's name, glowing on his phone for the first time in 3 years. If this story is making you think about your own relationships, your own chances to break cycles, you need to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller. We're building a community here of people who believe in growth, redemption, and authentic human connection. And if you're watching this without subscribing, do me a favor and comment below with your honest reason. No judgment, I just want to understand what stops people from clicking that button. Harold stared at his phone like it might explode in his hand. Vanessa's name on the screen, that simple collection of letters he'd seen in his contacts for 3 years without ever seeing it light up with an actual call. His hands were shaking, actually trembling like he was 18 instead of 78. He almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. What if she was calling to tell him about the lawsuit? What if Dylan had convinced her to join his side? What if this was just another door slamming in his face? But Sophie was watching him from across the room with those blue eyes, and Nathan was there, and something about their presence gave him courage he wouldn't have had alone. He swiped to answer. Vanessa! His voice came out rough, uncertain. For a moment there was only silence on the line, and Harold thought she might have called by accident, might hang up without speaking. Then he heard her voice, and it was different than he remembered. Older, tired, strained in a way that made his chest hurt. Dad! Just that one word, and Harold could hear everything underneath it. Fear, desperation, pride wrestling with need. Is everything okay? Harold asked, and immediately realized what a stupid question that was. Of course everything wasn't okay. She wouldn't be calling him if everything was okay. Vanessa let out a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been a sob. No, she said. Nothing's okay. The story came out in pieces, fragments she forced through what sounded like tears she was trying to hold back. She was pregnant. 5 months. High-risk pregnancy with complications that Harold didn't fully understand but sounded serious. Preeclampsia. Bed rest. Doctor's orders not to work, not to stress, basically not to do anything but lie still and try to keep this baby safe. Her husband, James, had lost his teaching position. Budget cuts. Last hired, first fired. Same story Nathan had told. They'd been living paycheck to paycheck even with both incomes. And now with just one income gone and medical bills piling up from the pregnancy complications, they were 3 months behind on mortgage payments. The bank had sent foreclosure notices. They were losing the house. Vanessa's voice cracked as she explained all this, and Harold could hear how much it cost her to tell him. To admit that her life had fallen apart. To ask her father for help after 3 years of silence, after blocking his number, after making it clear she wanted nothing to do with him. I know what you're thinking, she said, voice tight. I know you want to say you told me so. That you were right about James. That I should have listened to you. And you were right, okay? He's not good with money. He makes terrible financial decisions. He's irresponsible, and we're losing everything because of it. You were right. Are you happy now? Harold's first instinct, his immediate gut reaction, was to agree. To point out that, yes, he had been right. He tried to warn her, and she'd thrown his concern back in his face and married James anyway. The old Harold would have lectured her about poor choices and consequences, and learning hard lessons about fiscal responsibility. The old Harold would have used this moment to prove a point, to establish that he'd been the smart one all along. But then he caught himself, heard Nathan's words echoing in his head. My girl will never wonder if her daddy loves her. Saw Sophie standing in the doorway watching him, waiting to see what kind of man he'd be in this moment. Remembered the letter he'd been writing, the apology he'd been struggling to articulate, and he made a choice, a different choice than he'd ever made before. He took a breath, felt something shift inside his chest, and said, What do you need? Just tell me what you need. The silence on the other end of the line stretched, so long Harold thought the call had dropped. Then he heard Vanessa crying, really crying now, the kind of sobbing that comes when you've been holding yourself together for so long that the smallest kindness breaks you completely. I wasn't expecting that, she managed to say between sobs. I thought you'd. I was ready for you to. Dad, I don't know what I need. I don't know how to fix this. Everything's falling apart, and I'm supposed to stay calm for the baby, but I can't stop being terrified, and James is trying so hard, but he's falling apart too, and I'm scared. Harold felt tears running down his own face, hot and unexpected. I'm sorry, he said, and the words came easier than he thought they would. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you were growing up. I'm sorry I missed your childhood because I was too busy building something I thought mattered more. I'm sorry I made your wedding about money instead of celebrating your love. I'm sorry I was judgmental instead of supportive. I'm sorry I've been a terrible father. Vanessa's breathing had gone quiet, like she was holding her breath. Dad, she said, And it was the first time she called him that in years. Really called him that with something other than anger or obligation behind it. The word sounded tentative, fragile, like she was testing whether it was safe to use it again. Harold pressed on, feeling like if he stopped talking he might lose his nerve. I have 17 empty bedrooms in this house. You and James should come stay here. Both of you. For as long as you need. You can rest, really rest, without worrying about mortgage payments. We can get you set up with the best doctors. We can prepare for the baby together. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one anyway. Let me be there for you now. Please. He heard Vanessa breathing on the other end, heard her trying to process this, trying to decide if she could trust it. I don't know, she said finally. I don't know if I can do this. If you disappoint me again, Dad, I don't think I can take it. Not right now. Not with everything else. Harold understood. God, he understood. I'm not asking you to trust me, he said. I know I have to earn that back. I'm just saying I'm here. When you're ready. If you're ready. No conditions. No lectures. No I told you so. Just a place to stay, and a father who's finally figured out what matters. They talked for a few more minutes, Harold giving her his word that the offer stood regardless of what she decided, Vanessa saying she'd think about it. She'd talk to James. She'd let him know. When they hung up, Harold sat there holding his phone, staring at it like it held the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire adult life. Nathan appeared in the doorway. How'd it go? He asked quietly. And Harold, feeling something unfamiliar on his face, realized he was smiling. Actually smiling for the first time in he couldn't remember how long. I think I did it right this time, he said. Before Nathan could respond, before Harold could fully process what had just happened, there was a sharp knock at the front door. Not a doorbell ring. A knock. Hard, aggressive, insistent. Harold walked to the door and opened it, and standing on his doorstep looking furious and betrayed and hurt all at once was his son. Dylan had come home. Subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller if you believe people can change, if you've ever had to swallow your pride and do the right thing even when it's terrifying. And seriously, if you haven't subscribed yet, I need to know why. Are these stories too long? Too emotional? Not emotional enough? Drop a comment and tell me what would make you finally commit to this community. Dylan stood there on the doorstep, and Harold barely recognized him. His son was 38 years old now, but Harold still pictured him as that 14-year-old kid who'd stopped asking his father to come home. Dylan had his mother's eyes, Patricia's dark hair now showing threads of gray at the temples. He was wearing jeans and a sweater, and his face was red from either cold or anger. Harold couldn't tell which. Probably both. Dylan, Harold started, but his son pushed past him into the house, moving with the kind of aggressive energy that comes from someone who's been building up to this moment for a very long time. Dylan's eyes swept the foyer, taking in the Christmas decorations, the expense of everything, and then landed on Nathan and Sophie standing uncertainly in the living room doorway. His expression twisted into something ugly. Already replacing us with a new family? Dylan said, his voice sharp enough to cut. Is that how this works? Your actual children won't talk to you, so you find some strangers to play house with? How much are you paying them to pretend to care about you? Nathan immediately stepped forward, putting himself slightly between Dylan and Sophie. Hey, man, we're just... But Dylan wasn't listening. He turned back to Harold, and 3 years of silence came pouring out all at once. You ignored my lawyer's letter. Of course you did. You ignore everything that doesn't fit into your perfectly controlled world. You think you can just wait me out, like you've waited out everything else uncomfortable in your life? I'm done waiting, Dad. I'm done pretending I don't exist to make your life easier. Harold tried to speak, tried to calm him down, but Dylan was just getting started. The words came like a dam breaking. 30 years of resentment flooding out in a torrent Harold couldn't stop, even if he'd wanted to. Every missed baseball game, Dylan remembered them all, could list them by date and opponent. Every broken promise. Every time Harold had said he'd be there and then hadn't been. Every parent-teacher conference, Harold had sent Patricia to alone. Every Christmas morning Harold had spent on the phone with Hong Kong or London, or wherever was more important than watching his kids open presents. Dylan talked about being raised by nannies who were paid to care while his father conquered markets and closed deals and built an empire that meant nothing to a kid who just wanted his dad to throw a ball with him. He talked about his mother, and his voice broke when he did. She died because you stressed her to death. All those years of being alone, of raising us by herself, of waiting for you to notice she existed. The cancer didn't kill her, Dad. You did. You killed her just as surely as if you'd pulled a trigger, and then you stood at her funeral and talked about her strength like you hadn't spent 30 years breaking her. Harold felt each word land like a physical blow, but he didn't defend himself. Didn't interrupt. Didn't try to explain or justify. He just stood there and took it, because Dylan deserved to say all of this. Deserved to be heard. Deserved to have someone finally listen to the pain Harold had caused. Sophie had been watching all of this with wide eyes, pressed against Nathan's side. But then she did something no one expected. She walked straight up to Dylan, this tiny 7-year-old girl approaching a furious grown man, and asked in her clear child's voice, "Why are you yelling at the sad man?" Dylan stopped mid-sentence, thrown completely off balance by her directness. He looked down at her, this small person with blonde braids and fearless eyes, and seemed to really see her for the first time. "He's not," Dylan started, but Sophie interrupted him. "He is sad. I can tell. And he's trying to be good. That's really hard. My mommy used to say that trying to be good when you've been bad is the hardest thing in the world." Dylan's face did something complicated, anger mixing with confusion, mixing with something else Harold couldn't quite identify. Sophie continued, speaking with the simple wisdom children sometimes possess. "My mommy died too. Car accident. And I was really mad at everybody for a while because mad feels better than sad. But my daddy says being mad all the time just makes the hurt stay longer. It keeps you stuck." Dylan's eyes went to Nathan, really looking at him now, seeing him as a person instead of just an intruder in his father's house. Nathan met his gaze steadily. "I lost my wife 8 months ago," Nathan said quietly. "Drunk driver. I spent a long time being angry. At the driver. At God. At myself for not being there. At her for leaving us. Anger keeps the pain alive. Keeps it fresh. Makes you feel like you're doing something when really you're just bleeding out slowly." Dylan's jaw was clenched so tight Harold could see the muscles jumping, but something in his eyes had changed. Nathan continued, "I'm not saying your anger isn't justified. I don't know your story, but I do know that carrying that much rage is exhausting. And I know that at some point you have to decide if you want to stay angry or if you want to heal. Both are valid choices, but you can't do both." Dylan stood there breathing hard, and then something inside him seemed to break. His shoulders sagged. His face crumpled, and he said, voice cracking, "I miss him. I hate that I miss him. I hate that even after everything, even after knowing he'll never be what I needed, I still want his approval. I still want him to be proud of me. How pathetic is that?" Harold felt his own tears start again, but this time he didn't try to hide them. "It's not pathetic," he said, his voice rough. "It's human, and I'm the one who should be ashamed. You're right about everything, Dylan. Every single thing you said. I failed you. I chose work over you every single time. I convinced myself I was building your future when really I was just running away from being present in your life. Your mother died alone because I couldn't be bothered to sit with her. You and Vanessa grew up without a father because I was too busy being important. I failed at the only thing that actually mattered." He paused, making sure Dylan was really hearing him. "I can't change any of that. I can't go back and be at those baseball games, or take your mother to chemotherapy, or show up for your childhood. That's gone. But I'm here now if you'll let me try. Not to make myself feel better. Not to buy your forgiveness. Just to try. That's all I'm asking for. A chance to try." Dylan didn't say he forgave him. Didn't say everything was okay. He just stood there for a long moment, exhausted from carrying all that anger for so long, and then he moved to the couch and sat down heavily, like all the fight had drained out of him. Sophie, that brave, wonderful little girl, brought him a plate of cookies from the kitchen and sat down next to him without asking permission, just offering quiet company the way children do. And then, as if the universe had decided Harold had suffered enough, or maybe just to prove it had a sense of timing, there was another knock at the door. Harold opened it to find Vanessa standing there with a man who must be James, her face uncertain, scared, hopeful. She looked at Harold, then passed him to where Dylan sat on the couch, and her eyes widened. "Dylan," she said, "what are you doing here? If you've ever carried anger that exhausted you, If you know what it's like to want to forgive but not know how, you need to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller. We tell stories about messy, complicated, real human emotions, not fairy tales but actual healing. And if you're still not subscribing, I'm asking one more time, tell me in the comments what's stopping you. What do you need from this channel that you're not getting? The moments stretched out, all of them frozen in this tableau that would have seemed impossible 24 hours ago. Vanessa standing in the doorway, visibly pregnant now that Harold looked at her properly, her hand protectively on her belly. James beside her, looking nervous and uncertain. Dylan on the couch, cookies in his lap courtesy of Sophie. Nathan standing near the fireplace. And Harold in the middle of it all, this elderly man who'd built an empire and lost a family and was somehow, impossibly, getting a second chance. Vanessa and Dylan stared at each other across the room, and Harold could see all the years between them. They hadn't spoken either, he realized. The siblings had been estranged from each other just as much as from him, both too proud or too hurt or too stubborn to reach out first. Sophie broke the silence with the kind of enthusiasm only children possess. "This is your family," she said, looking between Dylan and Vanessa, and Harold like she'd just solved a puzzle. "They're here. They all came for Christmas." The innocence of her joy, the pure delight she took in this reunion, broke something in the room. Vanessa laughed, and it came out half-sob, and Dylan's face did that complicated thing again where too many emotions tried to exist at once. They looked at each other, really looked, and Harold could see the sibling bond underneath all the hurt. The years of being allies in their father's house, of understanding each other's disappointments, of being the only two people who knew what it was like to grow up as Harold Easton's children. Harold heard himself saying, "Stay for dinner. All of you. Please." His voice came out uncertain, almost pleading. "It's Christmas. We should eat together." He saw Dylan and Vanessa exchange a glance, having one of those silent sibling conversations that didn't require words. Finally, Vanessa nodded slightly, and James helped her to a chair because she was supposed to be on bed rest and standing was clearly exhausting her. Dylan stayed on the couch but didn't leave. It was enough. Harold went to the kitchen and stared at all the food Maria had prepared yesterday, cold and untouched, and realized he had no idea how to reheat any of it, much less serve it to 7 people. Nathan appeared beside him. "Let me help," he said simply, and together they figured it out. Vanessa waddled into the kitchen despite James's protests and started setting the table with Sophie, the little girl chattering away about how her mommy used to let her fold napkins into swans. Dylan eventually joined them, suspicious and watchful, clearly waiting for Harold to revert to his old patterns, to start lecturing or controlling or making everything about him. But Harold didn't. He just followed Nathan's instructions on how to reheat prime rib without destroying it, and listened to Sophie's stories, and watched his daughter teach the stranger's child how to arrange silverware properly. The house filled with sound, actual sound, laughter when Sophie dropped a spoon, gentle arguing between Nathan and Dylan about the proper temperature for reheating potatoes, Vanessa telling James to stop hovering. The sounds of life, of people, of family. The sounds Harold hadn't heard in this house in 10 years, maybe longer. They sat down to eat, all 7 of them crowded around that massive dining table that suddenly didn't seem quite so empty. Harold sat at the head out of habit, but this time the other chairs were filled. Dylan in his spot, Vanessa and James, Nathan and Sophie. People. Actual people who chose to be here. Harold stood up before they started eating, his hands shaking slightly, and everyone fell quiet. He didn't have a speech prepared, hadn't thought this far ahead. He just started talking, the words coming from somewhere honest and raw. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to be family. I spent my whole life building an empire and I lost a kingdom. I lost you." He looked at Dylan and Vanessa. "I lost your mother. I lost decades I can never get back. And I'm standing here at 78 years old, finally understanding what actually matters." He turned to Nathan and Sophie. "2 strangers showed up at my door last night, freezing and desperate, and they taught me in 18 hours what I should have learned 50 years ago. That presence is the only currency that matters. That showing up is everything. That love isn't something you buy, or schedule, or delegate. It's something you do. Every day. In the small moments. In the showing up." His voice cracked, and he didn't try to hide it. "I'm sorry. To both of you. For all of it. I know sorry isn't enough. I know it doesn't erase 30 years of absence. But it's where I have to start. Vanessa was crying openly now, and Harold continued. I'm not offering you money. I know that's what I always did before. Here's a trust fund, here's a check, here's a solution I can buy. But that's not what you needed. What you needed was me. He looked at Vanessa. I want to be at your doctor appointments. I want to help prepare for the baby. I want to learn how to be a grandfather instead of just funding a college account. He turned to Dylan. I want to meet your wife properly. I want to learn who she is, what she loves, what makes her laugh. I want to earn my way back into your life, not buy it. Dylan and Vanessa looked at each other, and Harold could see them processing this, trying to decide if they could trust it. If this change was real or just another performance. Dylan spoke first, his voice rough. I'm withdrawing the lawsuit. I don't want your money, Dad. I never wanted your money. I just wanted you to notice I was gone. To care that I walked away. To fight for me instead of just opening your checkbook. Vanessa nodded, wiping her eyes. I'm terrified of becoming a parent. I have no idea what I'm doing. And I need my dad. I've needed you this whole time, and I was just too angry and too hurt to admit it. Harold felt tears running down his face freely now, and he didn't care who saw. Nathan and Sophie stood up quietly, trying to give the family privacy, trying to slip away to let them have this moment. But Harold stopped them. Wait, he said. You're part of this now. Both of you. You don't get to leave. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in redemption and second chances and families that grow beyond blood, you absolutely need to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller. We're creating a community of people who believe people can change, that love can heal, that it's never too late. And if you're still not subscribing after watching this far, I need you to comment below and tell me honestly what the issue is, because at this point I'm genuinely baffled why you wouldn't want more of these stories in your life. Nathan sat down slowly, Sophie climbing into the chair beside him, and the seven of them ate Christmas dinner together. The food was lukewarm at best, the coordination was chaotic, and it was the most beautiful meal Harold had ever experienced. They talked and laughed and argued about small things that didn't matter. Dylan told a story about his wife Sarah that made everyone laugh. Vanessa explained her pregnancy complications in medical detail that made James squeeze her hand. Sophie told them all about the card house she and Harold had built. And somewhere during the meal, Harold realized he was happy. Actually, genuinely happy. Not the satisfaction of closing a deal or the pride of acquisition. Just the simple joy of being surrounded by people he loved who chose to be there. 6 months later, the house looked completely different. Not in terms of decoration or furniture, but in terms of life. Nathan had taken the job as operations director for Harold's property management company, and he was thriving. Turned out being a construction foreman had given him exactly the skills Harold needed, someone who could spot when contractors were inflating costs, when buildings needed real repairs versus cosmetic fixes, when managers were more interested in appearances than substance. Nathan and Sophie lived in the guest house on the property, a smaller building Harold had forgotten existed until Nathan suggested it. Sophie had her own room painted yellow because that was her favorite color. She'd started talking more, laughing more, being a kid again instead of a grieving shadow. She called Harold Grandpa Harry, and the first time she'd said it, Harold had cried right there in the kitchen while making her breakfast. Dylan came for dinner every Wednesday now, bringing his wife Sarah, and Harold was learning who she actually was beyond the financial profile he'd commissioned. She taught high school English, loved terrible reality television, made Dylan laugh in ways Harold had never managed to. They were good together. Really good. And Harold had been wrong about her, wrong about so many things. Vanessa had moved into the mansion during her pregnancy, taking one of those 17 empty bedrooms and making it hers. James had found a new teaching position, but the commute was long and Vanessa needed to be on bed rest, so Harold had insisted they stay. And this time when he insisted, it wasn't about control or showing off his wealth. It was about being there, about being present. Harold went to every doctor appointment, sitting in the waiting room with magazines he didn't read, just being there in case Vanessa needed him. He learned about preeclampsia and blood pressure and all the things that could go wrong. He held her hand when she was scared. He brought her books and terrible daytime television and just sat with her when she didn't want to be alone. When Vanessa went into labor on a Tuesday afternoon in June, Harold was there. In the delivery room. Something he'd never done for his own children, had never even considered doing. He'd been at business dinners when both Dylan and Vanessa were born, had shown up hours later with expensive gifts and an assistant carrying flowers. But this time he was there, watching his daughter bring life into the world, seeing her strengthen her fear and her absolute determination. When the baby girl was born, healthy and screaming and perfect, Vanessa looked at Harold through exhausted tears and said, "Her name is Patricia. After Mom." Harold held his granddaughter for the first time, this tiny human who weighed nothing and everything, and he made her a promise. "I won't miss this time," he whispered. "I promise you, little one. I'll be here for all of it." Dylan was there too, having rushed from work when he got the call, and Harold saw him watching this interaction with something like wonder on his face, watching his father be present in a way he'd never been before, seeing genuine change instead of empty promises. Harold had done something else with his wealth, something that felt more meaningful than any acquisition or investment he'd made in 40 years of business. He'd established a foundation for single parents, named it the Rachel Reeves Foundation after Nathan's wife. It funded emergency housing for families in crisis, job training programs, subsidized childcare, legal assistance. Everything Nathan had needed and hadn't had when his wife died and his world fell apart. The foundation's mission was simple: keep families together. Give parents the support they needed to be present for their children instead of working 3 jobs just to survive. Dylan and Vanessa ran it together, and watching them work side by side, healing their own relationship while helping others, gave Harold more satisfaction than every trophy and award he'd collected in his corporate career. He attended every board meeting, but this time he actually listened instead of dominating, asked questions instead of giving orders, learned instead of lecturing. One afternoon, Sophie found Harold sitting in the garden, just enjoying the summer sun. She climbed into his lap without asking, sticky from the popsicle she'd been eating, and asked, "Grandpa Harry, are you still sad?" Harold thought about it, really thought about it. "No, sweetheart," he said. "I'm the richest man in the world now." Sophie tilted her head, curious. "Because of all the people?" she asked. Harold smiled, holding her close despite the sticky popsicle hands. "Because of all the love," he said. And she hugged him, really hugged him, and Harold realized this was what wealth actually looked like. Not zeros in a bank account. This. Just this. Christmas Eve came around again, 1 year after Nathan, and Sophie had knocked on Harold's door and changed everything. The dining table was full. Dylan and Sarah, Vanessa and James, baby Patricia in a high chair, managing to get more food on herself than in her mouth. Nathan and Sophie, permanent fixtures now, family in every way that mattered. Harold sat at the head of the table, surrounded by noise and chaos and laughter and arguments about whether the potatoes needed more salt and whether the baby should be allowed to have pie. He thought back to last year, sitting alone in the same room, staring at his phone that wouldn't ring, convinced he'd lost everything that mattered. One doorbell, one desperate moment, one choice to open the door instead of closing it. That's all it had taken to change everything. He looked around at his real wealth, at the people who chose to be here not because of his money but in spite of it. People who loved him not for what he could give them but for who he was trying to become. Nathan caught his eye across the table and raised his glass, slightly in a silent toast. Sophie was teaching baby Patricia how to clap, the baby's uncoordinated hands smacking together in delight. Dylan and Vanessa were arguing about something, actually arguing like siblings do, comfortable enough to disagree without it destroying their relationship. And Harold understood finally, at 79 years old, what it meant to be rich. It wasn't about what you built. It was about who you built it with. It wasn't about what you achieved. It was about who was there to celebrate with you. It wasn't about leaving a legacy measured in dollars. It was about leaving a legacy measured in love. Harold had spent his whole life chasing the wrong things, and one knock at the door at midnight on Christmas Eve had taught him what actually mattered. Presence, love, family, both the one you're born into and the one you choose. The chance to break cycles instead of repeating them. The courage to change even when you think it's too late. It was never too late. That was the lesson. As long as you were breathing, it was never too late to become the person you should have been all along. If you made it to the end of the story, if you felt every emotion along the way, if you believe that one moment of courage can change everything, subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller right now. We tell stories that make you feel, make you think, make you believe in the power of human connection. This is a community of people who value vulnerability, redemption, and second chances. Don't just watch and disappear, join us. Click that subscribe button. And if you've watched this entire story and you're still not subscribing, I genuinely need you to comment below and explain your reasoning, because I cannot understand why you'd invest an hour in this story and not want more. Tell me what's missing. Tell me what would make you commit. I'm listening. The final scene of their story, or at least this portion of it, happened at sunset in their favorite diner, the one where everything had started 3 years ago when a billionaire had decided to meet a nurse as an equal rather than a charity case. The coffee was still terrible, the vinyl booths were still cracked, and the normalcy of it all was a choice they'd made deliberately, a rejection of the expensive restaurants and exclusive events that Elias's wealth could have bought them. This was real, this was them, and this was enough. His confession came over refills that the waitress had long since stopped charging them for, his nervous energy visible in the way he kept adjusting his coffee cup and avoiding her eyes. "I have something to ask you," he started, and Imani's immediate nervousness made her tense. "Elias," she began, but he cut her off gently. "Do you trust me?" The question hung between them, loaded with history and weight and the memory of 3 months when trust had been tested and broken, and slowly, painfully rebuilt. Her answer came after a moment of genuine consideration, because she'd learned that honesty mattered more than easy comfort. "I'm learning to. Every day, I trust you a little more. Every day, you show me I'm right to trust you." His smile was nervous, almost boyish, so different from the polished businessman who'd walked into St. Michael's emergency room 3 years ago. "Good. Because I'm terrified." Her confusion was evident. "Of what?" His answer was raw and vulnerable, the kind of admission that cost him something to make. "Of losing you again. Of messing this up. Of doing something that makes you walk away and realizing too late that I've destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me." Her response was immediate and tinged with the humor that had become their way of healing old wounds. "Then don't fake your death again. Simple rule. Maybe write it down if you need a reminder." Their laughter filled the diner, drawing fond looks from the waitress and the handful of other patrons who'd witnessed their reunion over the past year and had invested themselves in the outcome of this improbable love story. His hand covered hers on the scarred table, his touch warm and steady and present. "I love you," he said, and the simplicity of the words made them more powerful than any elaborate declaration. "The real me loves the real you. Not the version of me who thought money could solve everything, or the version of you who thought she had to do everything alone. Just us. Just this." Her answer came through tears that were happy and healing, through a smile that had taken a year to feel natural again. "I love you too, even when you're an idiot. Especially when you're an idiot, because at least then I know you're being honest." The final image of their story is this: 2 people who survived betrayal and grief and lies and their own worst instincts, who came through fire and chose not to let it consume them, who learned that love isn't about perfection or grand gestures or surveillance rooms and protection details. It's about showing up every day and choosing each other repeatedly, about Wednesday night coffee and terrible diner food and honest conversations that sometimes hurt but always matter. It's about daisies on a grave that marks a death that never happened and a life that almost ended but didn't. They're still choosing each other, will keep choosing each other tomorrow and next week and next year, for as long as choice remains possible and love remains real. No more graves, no more ghosts, no more surveillance cameras watching from the shadows. Just 2 people who learn the hard way that love earned through fire is the kind that lasts forever, that trust rebuilt is stronger than trust that was never tested, that sometimes you have to lose everything to learn what actually matters. Just love, real and messy and complicated and absolutely worth every single moment of pain it took to get here. That's the end of the story. But if you're not subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller, you're going to miss dozens more just like it. This is your absolute last chance. Hit that subscribe button right now. And if you're still not going to do it, I need you to comment below and explain what's wrong with you. I'm serious. I want to understand the psychology of someone who watches an entire hour-long story and then chooses not to subscribe. Enlighten me. Everyone else, welcome to the family. See you in the next story.